One called her moderately pretty, another focused on her eyes, describing them as compelling, able to command attention. What distinguished Anne wasn't her face, it was everything she'd learned in France: how to move, how to dress, how to speak, how to be fascinating. She wore English fashion that day because she was smart enough to adapt to her audience, but everyone could tell she was different, more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan, more educated, more confident. She'd conversed with regents and religious reformers. She'd served in the two most powerful courts in Europe. She'd been educated like a prince, not a princess. And this is what made Anne Boleyn dangerous. Not her beauty or sexuality or feminine wiles as she's often portrayed, but her education and confidence. She'd been taught that she was as intelligent as men. She'd been treated as an intellectual equal at the French court. She expected to be taken seriously when she discussed theology or politics. She believed her opinions mattered, and in Tudor England, a woman who believed she was men's intellectual equal was inherently threatening to the entire social order built on female subordination. Within a few years of Anne's return, Henry VIII noticed her. The traditional narrative says Anne seduced Henry, that she deliberately set out to become queen. But consider what we know about Anne's formation. She'd been educated to value learning and religious reform. She'd seen powerful women like Louise of Savoy and Margaret of Angoulême shape politics and theology. She'd absorbed religious ideas that challenged Catholic orthodoxy. She'd developed sophisticated conversation skills that made her compelling to educated men. When Henry VIII, increasingly desperate for a male heir and increasingly frustrated with Catherine of Aragon's inability to provide one, became interested in Anne, she didn't respond like most women would have. She didn't become his mistress, as her sister Mary had done. She insisted on marriage. And crucially, she engaged Henry intellectually. She discussed theology with him. She shared reformist texts with him. She encouraged his growing conviction that the Pope had no authority to prevent him from annulling his marriage to Catherine. Anne's education made her able to be Henry's intellectual partner in a way Catherine, for all her learning, couldn't be. Catherine was rigidly Orthodox Catholic. Anne was open to religious reform. Catherine accepted the Pope's authority, absolutely. Anne questioned it. Catherine had been raised to be queen. Anne had been raised to think for herself. And that ability to think for herself, to engage Henry as an intellectual equal, to challenge religious orthodoxy, made her irresistible to Henry, while also making her ultimately vulnerable. Because here's the terrible paradox of Anne Boleyn's story. The same qualities that attracted Henry VIII were the qualities that made her destroyable. Henry wanted a queen who was educated, sophisticated, engaged with religious reform, willing to challenge orthodoxy, but he still expected that queen to be ultimately subordinate to him. When Anne failed to produce a male heir, when she continued to voice strong opinions even after becoming queen, when she demonstrated that her education and confidence weren't just attractive qualities but fundamental aspects of who she was, Henry turned on her. A less educated woman might have survived by becoming pliant and submissive when circumstances changed. Anne couldn't do that. She'd been trained her entire life to believe in her own intelligence and worth. She'd spent years at courts where women wielded real power. She couldn't suddenly become demure and silent just because Henry's affection had turned to hostility. Her perseverance, the quality she'd symbolically embodied at her court debut, became stubbornness in Henry's eyes. Her education became pretentiousness, her confidence became arrogance, and her continuing inability to produce a male heir gave Henry the excuse he needed to destroy her. Thomas Cromwell fabricated charges of adultery with 5 men, including Anne's own brother George, charges so absurd that even contemporaries who disliked Anne didn't believe them. But the charges worked because Anne had made enemies through being too educated, too French, too confident, too powerful. She'd threatened the social order that required female subordination. Look back at Anne's Book of Hours, where she'd written, "Le temps viendra," the time will come. She'd written it probably in the 1,520 seconds, believing the time would come when Christ returned and true faith was established. She may also have hoped the time would come when she'd be queen. Both things happened. She became queen in 1533. Religious reform came to England through Henry's break with Rome, a break Anne had encouraged and supported. The time came. But it came with a cost. Anne couldn't have imagined when she wrote those words as a young woman. The time came when she was queen, but it lasted only 3 years. The time came when England broke from Rome, but Anne was blamed for it by those who hated the Reformation. The time came when she had power, but that power made her vulnerable. Everything she'd been educated to become, everything she'd learned at Margaret of Austria's court and at the French court, everything that made her remarkable, also made her expendable when she failed to fulfill the one role Henry VIII actually cared about, producing a male heir. On the 19th of May, 1536, 14 years after her debut at the English court playing Perseverance, Anne Boleyn knelt on a scaffold and died for the crime of being too educated, too confident, and too incapable of controlling her own fertility in an age when a woman's value was measured solely by the sons she produced. The irony is that Anne's greatest legacy, the child who would vindicate everything she stood for, was the daughter Henry, considered a disappointment, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, born in 1533, was declared illegitimate after Anne's execution. Henry moved on to Jane Seymour, then Anne of Cleves, then Catherine Howard, then Catherine Parr, desperately seeking the male heir who would secure the Tudor dynasty. He did get a son, Edward VI, from Jane Seymour. Edward became king at age 9 when Henry died in 1547, but Edward died at 15 in 1553, having ruled only 6 years. After Edward came Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, who ruled 5 years before dying childless in 1558. Then came Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child Henry and Cromwell had tried to erase from succession, the illegitimate daughter of an executed traitor. And Elizabeth ruled for 44 years, transforming England into a major world power, presiding over a cultural golden age, and becoming one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Everything Anne had been educated to be sophisticated, multilingual, politically astute, religiously reformed, intellectually confident, Elizabeth embodied. Anne had been destroyed for possessing those qualities. Elizabeth was celebrated for them. Elizabeth rarely spoke publicly about her mother, which was politically wise, but she kept a ring that contained secret portraits of both herself and Anne facing each other. The ring never left her finger until her deathbed. It was a private acknowledgement of the debt she owed to the mother she barely remembered, the mother who'd been judicially murdered when Elizabeth was 2 years old. Anne's time came, after all, just not in the way anyone expected. So, who was Anne Boleyn before she became the woman executed at the Tower? She was a diplomat's daughter, educated like a prince. She was a 12-year-old, sent alone across the Channel to serve a powerful regent. She was a teenager thrust into French royal politics, serving queens, witnessing marriages made and unmade for diplomatic advantage. She was a young woman exposed to radical religious ideas at the most sophisticated court in Europe. She was someone who learned from powerful women like Margaret of Austria and Louise of Savoy that women could wield genuine political authority. She was a person who absorbed Margaret of Angouléme's conviction that religious reform was both possible and necessary. She was someone who spent 7 formative years becoming cosmopolitan, educated, confident, and convinced of her own intellectual worth. She was a woman who returned to England more sophisticated than almost anyone at court, and who couldn't or wouldn't hide that sophistication when circumstances required submission. She was someone whose education made her irresistible to Henry VIII and ultimately made her destroyable by him. She was, quite simply, too educated, too confident, too powerful, for a world that required women to be none of those things. And that's why Anne Boleyn's story matters 500 years later, not because she seduced a king or wore pretty dresses or got dramatically executed, but because she represents what happens when women are educated to believe in their own worth and then punished for actually believing it. This is Flow of History, where we uncover the real stories behind the myths. Anne Boleyn wasn't a seductress or a victim. She was an exceptionally educated woman destroyed by a system that couldn't tolerate female intellectual equality. If this story revealed something you never learned in school, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. We're uncovering the truth behind every historical figure they sanitized, simplified, or straight up lied about. The past is more complicated, more brutal, and more relevant than you think. Let's keep digging.